Today's guest doesn't just write horror, he dissects the human soul with a scalpel of lyrical dread. From the bleak and beautiful mind behind Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, Eric LaRocca joins me to talk about his newest novel, At Dark, I Become Loathsome. We dive into buried alive rituals, grief-fueled obsession, queer body horror, and the thin, rotting line between salvation and self-destruction. This one's raw, philosophical, and unforgettable. So without further ado, I give you Eric LaRocca. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I appreciate you joining me today on this 6th day of May 2025. I came across your work on Bookstagram and had been aware of your reputation as a writer of the dark and disturbing for quite some time. I decided to check out At Dark, I Become Loathsome to see what all the hype was about. And your work not only lived up to it, but exceeded it. Your writing is literary yet extreme, emotional yet cold and calculating, and it maintains this unsettling juxtaposition throughout the novel. It leaves the reader confused, anxious, disturbed, and craving more, and was a pleasure to read. So I really appreciate you joining me on the show today to discuss this remarkable work.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. I really, really am so glad that you dug it. And yeah, I can't wait to talk about it with you more.
Absolutely. Well, so kind of a brief synopsis, the book follows a grieving widower named Ashley Luton who offers people that are trapped in the throes of depression and grief a chance at a sort of rebirth. He guides them through a ritual that involves being buried alive for about a half an hour before he digs them back up. And as they emerge from their own grave, they experience a kind of spiritual reboot, a renewed lease on life. Ashley performs this ritual successfully multiple times, but eventually things spiral out of control because at dark, Ashley becomes loathsome. And that is where the story begins. So I looked it up, and the 3 places that I saw, Russia, Thailand, and South Korea, there are actual, I don't know if you'd call them companies, organizations that offer controlled, quote, buried alive experiences as symbolic rites of passage or extreme therapeutic exercises. Have you or someone you known undergone one of these rituals? Because I hear about shamanic DMT or ayahuasca trips, but this seems like way more intense.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have not gone through this. The whole genesis of this book really began when I was on, it was either ID or Vice, like one of those news sites. And I was reading an article about what you just described, these like organizations in Asia that allow people to have this like therapeutic rebirth by being buried alive. And I was so intrigued with the whole concept of, burial being a form of like rebirth, reincarnation. And to me, it felt like the perfect backdrop to set a story against. Something that kind of was just like in the background, not like the whole focal point of the story, but something that like a main character maybe participated in or organized somehow. And that's kind of where like a lot of my books previously have been very like plot driven and very much driven by like the narrative and, different sort of events throughout a character's journey. But this was really a departure for me because it was really the first book that I had written that was more of like an intimate character study. And I really wanted this book to be that. I wanted it to be this like really kind of introspective, somber, character study about Ashley, about him navigating his grief, the world he exists in, because it's like my books are strange in that they take place in like what we could perceive as like our own world, but I feel like they're slightly removed. Like everything is sort of like rotted and decaying, and everything is just sort of like almost like Lynchian. Like everything kind of operates with like a really almost like a nightmare logic. I mean, that's kind of how I view my work and like the world in which I set, the stories I'm telling. But yeah, I mean, this book really started with the whole concept of death and burial as a form of reincarnation and transformation, more importantly. And a lot of my work has been centered around like the body, like specifically like the queer body. And I've really been honored to kind of, explore those subjects in really like dark, transgressive ways. And I'm not interested in writing, sanitized versions of queerness. I'm really more interested in writing like dark, sort of complex, intricate works that hopefully speak to people who are feeling disenfranchised or marginalized. That's what's really exciting to me. But yeah, this whole concept really originated from that article that I read about the burials as like a form of like as almost like a business that you could run, and it felt like so sterile and clinical, but also like really intimate and just strange at the same time. And it just felt like the perfect backdrop for this novel in particular.
Yeah, there's so many things that kind of, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but like kind of coincide. You've got not only burial, but you've got the literal rebirth, because it's kind of like being back in your mother's womb. And I can only imagine what would happen, because have you ever done the float tank? They call it the sensory deprivation
No,
tank.
I've heard of it. I have friends who have done it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I've only done, I think I did like an hour and a half, but supposedly if you stay in those long enough, you start having maybe not full on visions, but some sort of like somewhat psychedelic experiences. I cannot imagine like being buried alive, just complete sensory, like, just you can't hear anything, see anything. I mean, I guess you can still feel, but at a certain point, your senses just kind of have to shut down. And I decided to, against my better judgment, actually look this up because I am claustrophobic. This is my nightmare.
Yeah.
But I looked it up and I'm like, so did you look up this guy, The Guardian?
No, I
The
didn't.
Guardian
I haven't seen
article?
that. No.
Yeah. I was buried alive in a shamanic ritual.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's like in every culture is like almost, death and burial as like a type of rebirth, I feel like.
Yeah.
So it's pretty prevalent.
Like this is just.
Yeah, that's pretty intense.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. I was about to say I don't think I could do it. I know I couldn't do it.
Yeah, same. And like so much of writing, I feel like is, you know, Paul Tremblay says this all the time, but he's like, write about your obsessions, write about what, I mean, he doesn't say this part, but like, write what scares you, what actually scares you. Because that's like very generic sort of advice, like write what scares you if you're a horror author. But it's so true. Like, I mean, this kind of fear is deeply rooted in me of being buried alive, being in some sort of like tight space that you can't escape from. And I feel like horror fiction does that really, really well. The kinds of horror fiction that I really respond well to are books that are like slim and they pack a big punch and they're taut and they're really like, not a lot of characters, maybe minimal locations, and they just feel like claustrophobic. And I feel like horror really excels in that area. And to me, like, I really wanted this book to have that feel of something that was like very claustrophobic, very, difficult to kind of break free from.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off what you said about Tremblay, talking about writing what you're scared about. I had Paula Diash on the show, and she was talking about how a lot of her friends that were writers, once they had children, they would no longer write anything that had to do with children being harmed. But Paula Diash said, well, actually, when I had children, now I'm like, okay, now I have all new things to be scared of, all new things to write about.
Totally. I love Paula. She's so smart and just such a great writer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in what ways do you think confronting mortality in such a direct manner could actually lead to emotional or psychological clarity?
I think it's definitely... it definitely feels like a moment of transformation. I mean, the people who are going to Ashley are at the end of their rope entirely. They are on the brink of suicide, of wanting to end their lives. They're severely depressed and they feel like they have nothing else to live for. And I feel like confronting death in such a really sort of like direct way, a way that you can't circumvent, you can't like talk it off, you can't kind of ignore it. You're there in the coffin with dirt being shoveled on top of you. It really, I feel like, makes you realize, at least it would for me, if I'm putting myself in that position, in the coffin, I would imagine that I would feel really grateful for being alive and that this isn't my reality and that someone is going to hopefully dig me up at the end of this like 30-minute session. I feel like confronting mortality in that way would definitely lead people to kind of have these like very transformative experiences, just like what you had described with the sensory deprivation tank. I feel like it's a very similar thing. And obviously, cultures around the world have practiced this before. This is not something that I specifically invented for this book. I mean, this is something that exists already in the world. So I think it's something that is, yeah, it has the power to provide like rebirth and reincarnation, like spiritually. Maybe you exit the burial feeling more grateful or more centered. I'm obviously not suggesting that people should go out and like have someone bury them alive for 30 minutes, but I think within the context of the book, to me, it makes sense. It makes sense that these people would come to Ashley after he kind of like sort of sifted through the possible candidates on the dark web where he kind of like, lures people into his web. I feel like they would have those sort of responses to the ritual if he performed it correctly. But, without going into spoiler territory, the ritual sort of like shifts around the midpoint of the book and new things start happening. And that's when the horror really seeps into the novel.
That's when he becomes loathsome.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, one thing it made me think of is there's a bridge in Houston that's gigantic and a lot of people jump from it and a lot of people survive. And one of the most common things that they find out from those people is what was the first thing that went through your mind when you jumped? Is regret. Like they're like, I wish I hadn't have done this. So
Really?
it's kind of like the burial. It's like, yeah, you're confronting death and you're in there and you're like, so is this what I really want?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really powerful. I had never heard about that before, that they would have that. I mean, I believe that they have that reaction, but that's really, that's like very unsettling to hear that the first thing they think of is like regret. But it makes sense because it speaks to what I was just saying about, you are confronting this head on and you're in it. You can't avoid it anymore. You would feel regret, but it's really like unsettling to hear that from people who have survived it.
Yeah. There's so many, there's a lot of boats that go through this particular area. So even if they hit the water and go unconscious, there's usually a boat close by to snatch them out of the water.
Wow, that's pretty grim.
Yeah. Well, so as I've stated already, Ashley is a widower who lost his wife to cancer. And to make matters worse, his child was kidnapped, leaving him in a state of agonizing limbo, not knowing whether his child is alive or dead. So, what kind of emotional terrain were you hoping to explore by placing him in such a prolonged state of uncertainty?
I think the book for me really started with Ashley. I really wanted the book to focus on someone who had gone through a substantial amount of trauma and suffering in a very short period of time. And I wanted to explore the implications of that, how grief kind of rots a person from the inside out if managed incorrectly. I feel like the book really illustrates how much there is like suffering in humanity and how we're all kind of like bonded by our suffering, but also like we're alienated by it as well, if that makes sense. We're all kind of like isolated from one another. And Ashley's just like desperately trying to connect with people. And he's essentially just managing his grief and pain totally incorrect. He's doing this sort of ritual that he's trying to help people, but in the same breath, he's really like hurting himself. He's like mutilating himself literally and figuratively. Like he's piercing himself with all of these like body modifications and these like implants. And, I'm not saying that those sort of modifications are wrong in any way. The book really stresses the fact that he's doing this not for the liberation that is usually felt with piercing and body mod. He's doing this as like a form of punishment. So totally different than what is like the common practice of like body modification and like getting implants and stuff like that. So I really wanted this book to kind of explore his personal downfall, his sort of decay. I was really influenced by this excellent film from Czechoslovakia in like the late 1960s called The Cremator, which is an excellent, excellent film. It's definitely a horror film, but some people categorize it as like a comedy. It's like a very black comedy, if it is a comedy.
The Cremator, you said?
Yeah, The Cremator from like 1969. It's by a director known as Uri Hertz, but it's about he works at a crematorium and he decides that he's going to purge the world of all suffering by like cremating people. And that's the hook of the film. And the film, when I saw it, was just so bleak and depressing and really just unsettling. Yeah, I mean, some of the stills from it are just like totally just insane. It really focuses a lot on like death and decay. And I feel like it's a really good companion piece with At Dark I Become Loathsome. It's just about his disintegration with his family sort of like watching him spiral out of control. So, yeah, so I really wanted, like I said earlier, I really wanted this to be like a character study, but I wanted to kind of showcase that sort of bleakness that I saw in that film and other works that I admire. A lot of people have compared the book Dark I Become Loathsome to books like Exquisite Corpse by Poppy Z. Bright, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And I feel like it definitely shares a lot of similarities with that book, especially like Poppy Z. Bright is known for writing very like poetic, sort of lyrical horror, very Baroque sentences, almost like a neo-Gothic. And I would definitely classify At Dark I Become Loathsome not as like a neo-Gothic, but almost like a maybe neo-splatterpunk in a lot of ways, because splatterpunk kind of like has all these like social implications attached to it. Like the term splatterpunk, the books are usually about something. And in this case, the book is really about grief and how it has the ability to like transform you in a really negative way if managed incorrectly. And yeah, that's really essentially like how I approached the book. So I don't know if that like answered your question.
Yeah,
but,
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing I noticed in the first chapter of the book, we are immediately brought into the ritual with Ashley and one of his clients. So, I mean, you're dropped straight into the discomfort of the situation without much of a backstory. So, was that an intentional narrative choice to mirror the disorientation of the ritual itself?
Yeah, I mean, I like books that sort of begin at like 100 and go from like ramp up even higher. Like, let's take it to 200, 300. Like, don't like, I don't like waiting that long for something really compelling or, you know, something to really capture me. It takes a lot to hook me in the beginning of a book. And I expect that from my readers. Like, I expect people are going to go into my book and they're going to find every reason maybe to leave. So I really want to give them the reason to stay. Like, I really want to keep them and hook them somehow. And I think starting in this place the way I do, I think it really sets you up for like what to expect later on in the novel. You know, if we're starting at this sort of really somber, almost alienating note with the burial, you know, what a reader is probably thinking to themselves, like, what else can we expect from this book? Like, where else is this going to go? Is more insanity going to creep in? Are we going to, deal with like more darkness, more bleakness? And with this book, I felt like starting it at that point, it made perfect sense to me and it felt like very organic. And I mean, one of the biggest writing, I hate saying like rules, but like critiques that you get is like you never start a story with like a character waking up or just like going about their day or whatever. Obviously, there are exceptions to every rule. And if you find a really compelling way to have a character wake up, then absolutely. But to me, this book, like, I really wanted it to start on this very grim, sort of sour note of Ashley burying a client. And like I said, like, I wanted to kind of cue readers up to what was going to happen later in the book with other sort of clients coming in and other, like, all of the other sort of like dark elements of the novel. And I had asked my editor at Blackstone for this book in particular, the more releases I do, the more we've been adding like content warnings to my books, just because I feel like it's the right thing to do, especially with the kind of like material that I'm writing and publishing. And this book, I forget, there's a content warning that I put on Goodreads, but I think Blackstone, I think they wanted to kind of like go a more traditional sort of like literary horror route with this book. And they wanted to market it to like fans of like Paul Tremblay and Cassandra Khaw and Richard Cadre, which I love all those authors. I think they're fabulous authors. But I'm very well aware that like my work kind of sits in like almost a different category just because of the content, because it is a little bit more extreme. So that being said, I feel like queuing it up with the sort of burial hopefully lets readers who are like uninitiated with my work realize like, okay, this is going to be a really like dark, depressing book. Like, should I keep going? And hopefully I give them reasons to keep reading. But if they can't handle it or they don't want to experience that sort of bleakness in a book, I wholeheartedly encourage them to kind of set it down and do something else, because I know that this book is like not for everybody. And more importantly, I feel like this book needs to be read at like the right time in your life because uh like it's so bleak and so depressing. I do worry what would happen to someone if they were reading it like at a really low point in their life. So I appreciate anyone who has been on like Goodreads or Storygraph and has listed like all of the content warnings of like grief and suicide and like all of those really important like content warnings. And I put content warnings in my own like little like essay that I wrote on Goodreads when the book was published. So I definitely think that's very important.
Did you intend for your readers to trust Ashley's narration? And listeners at home, I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I'm just curious about Eric's intention.
Yeah, I love an unreliable narrator. I love any character that something happens maybe midway through a book, maybe even at a reversal at the end, and you realize like everything you've been told has been like a deception. I think that that's really exciting and compelling for me as a reader. So I didn't necessarily want a reader to put all their trust in him, but enough trust that they would stick around with him for like 240 pages, if that makes sense. I wanted them to be curious about him. I don't really believe in writing very likable characters. That's just not my thing.
It's boring.
I don't like writing about likable people. Nothing wrong with authors who write about likable, good-hearted, kind people. I think that's wonderful. But for me, like, what's interesting to me is in any sort of like horror, drama, science fiction, fantasy, like I want there to be like an intense level of conflict. And that conflict, the only way I really know how to bring it about in my own fiction and the work I've done for like theater and screenplays I've written, the only way I can really go about doing that is through characters who are struggling internally with themselves, who are facing a great deal of introspection and maybe like a little bit of self-loathing. They don't really know who they are. Maybe they make some really questionable decisions. I love any sort of character that has a lot of like moral ambiguity to them. So Ashley to me was like the perfect composite of what I look for in not only like me writing a character, but me reading like fiction, like transgressive horror fiction. I'm just very interested in like morally gray characters. And I feel like Ashley is a perfect example of that, like sort of morally questionable person where he's starting out the story as really benevolent in a lot of ways and very kind. Well, maybe not kind, but like compassionate for the people that he's kind of luring into his business, his like makeshift burial business. But he makes some very questionable choices throughout the narrative. And the closer we get to him, the more we kind of realize that there is like something wrong with him. His grief is sort of spoiling him from the inside out and just like rotting him. So maybe it's not him to blame entirely, it's just the circumstances surrounding him. But yeah, I don't know if I wanted readers to like distrust everything he said, but I certainly wanted them to be like on guard with him in a lot of ways and wonder, well, is he telling the truth in this instance? Like, I wanted them to have that sort of tug of war, like, oh yeah, like we can trust Ashley, like, he seems like he's had a rough go of it, but he seems like all right. Or, by the reversal of that, where like, oh, I don't know, like he's been so traumatized, like maybe he would lie to the reader. Maybe he would, tell us, try to deceive us. But it's a fine line between those two reactions. And it's difficult to really accomplish that in a book. At least for me, it was difficult in this book. And I don't know if I've succeeded or not with it. That's kind of where my mind was, like creating him in general, just like going through his character and following him through this like 200 plus page novel, just really kind of seeing how far I could tip the scale in one way or the other. Like, are people going to believe him? Are people not going to believe him?
Well, Ashley's view of life, at least on the surface, is deeply nihilistic. He believes there is no meaning or ultimate end, only complete nothingness. So, how much of Ashley's philosophy do you share or sympathize with as the writer?
I struggle because I feel like I go through periods where I have like intensely nihilistic views of just humanity and what this is all leading to, death being the final act and what waits for us like after death. And this is like very grim. These are very grim subjects. So it's difficult to articulate, but I mean, there are definitely moments when I think to myself, like, how frightened I am of the thought of there being nothing after all of this, after life, that maybe there isn't anything. And that definitely worries me and frightens me. So I try not to think about it too much. And it definitely gives me a lot of anxiety. But, I think at the end of the day, maybe they're just questions that I'm just like not meant to answer right now. And it's a touchy subject because we all have like our own beliefs. We all have our own like convictions of what happens after, what like humanity is supposed to stand for, what like being a human, like what it means to be a human. And the answers to those questions are like very, very complex, I feel. So I don't know. I feel like there are elements of me in Ashley, but not all of me in Ashley, because Ashley, in a lot of ways, I feel like represents the me of where, like, very pessimistic, viewing the world through one lens only. Ashley, to me, throughout the novel, he goes on this sort of like odyssey of like self-discovery of like his own identity as like a father and his own sexuality. But I don't know. I definitely feel like I share parts of him and I understand him, but I don't understand all of him. But I think empathy is really important when approaching any sort of character. And I really tried to approach Ashley with like a level of empathy that I feel like every character in a book should be afforded. I feel like authors, I talked about this in another interview recently, just like how accountability for a character's actions like isn't the most important thing, but rather like empathizing with the character and why they made those choices, even if they're, egregious decisions and actions. You have to sort of like understand them and the complexity of their character. And I definitely like struggled while writing Ashley because certain elements were somewhat close to how I felt and my own sort of like hangups with sexuality and the afterlife and humanity in general. But for the most part, I feel like writing in a lot of ways, like this book has been just a really amazing purge in a lot of ways. It's been like ways to kind of like exercise all of these like sort of fraught feelings and complex emotions about like life, death, and sexuality in a lot of ways. And yeah, writing to me is just like therapy in so many aspects. Like, so it was very cathartic, I will say, to write Ashley's character and kind of explore his intricacies as a character and also the other characters in the novel. There are like a few side characters in like a vignette that's like in the middle of the book that I was like very disturbing to write, but also like felt very freeing to write that sort of like nastiness on the page. That's what transgressive fiction is really feels like to me, is like it feels like that sort of permission to be grotesque and vile where it's like acceptable.
Well, speaking about the title, the repeated phrase, "At dark, I become loathsome," acts almost like a mantra. How did that line evolve during your writing process, and what does it mean to you personally?
Well, so the title for this book actually came at a later point in the writing process. And it was kind of difficult to kind of navigate the story at the beginning because I'm very superstitious when it comes to like writing any sort of project, like novella, short story, novel. like, I really need to have a title in place, like at least like a working title. And for this book in particular, I really struggled with a working title for quite some time. And I think I was just like doing the dishes or like folding laundry one day, and I thought about Ashley's character in general and just like how he feels. And I thought to myself, well, he feels loathsome. He feels this way particularly pronounced at nighttime when he's like sort of walking the streets, and he's like all like has his like body mods and like piercings and everything. He built himself to resemble the monster that he feels like he is inside. And the title just sort of like insidiously crept into my mind and was just like, it was just there, at dark I become loathsome. And then once I had that, I really felt like, all right, I really want there to be like a repetition to this. Like, I want it to be like almost like a refrain, almost like, a chorus of a song where you keep coming back to like the same lyrics, a couple times throughout the entirety of the song. And I really wanted the book to have that feel of that like repetition, and almost showcase like Ashley's descent into madness in a lot of ways, like how he just like keeps repeating this phrase like in his interior monologue, like at dark I become loathsome, at dark I become loathsome. And it's almost this like self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of ways. Like, he obviously becomes what he says he's going to be. Like, it's this like self-fulfilling prophecy where he it's just unavoidable. He can't really escape from it. And I wanted it to also kind of speak to the claustrophobia of the book as well, where you're like kind of trapped in the coffin of like one of Ashley's clients, and maybe just repeating the same sort of mantra again and again and again. So yeah, I wanted to evoke like madness, but also speak to his prophecy of destroying himself and like immolating himself in a lot of ways.
Yeah, they say you can't judge a book by its cover, but I call bullshit on that. That is that is fantastic.
Yeah, it's
Um,
such a striking image, isn't it?
yeah. Do you have anything to do with the input on these
Yeah,
covers?
I mean, I had complete creative control over pretty much for all of my books. I've had complete creative control, which has been amazing. And this cover in particular, I was really drawn to the work of Sarah Sitkin, who's an artist that lives in, I think, Los Angeles. And she does these really like gnarly, like grotesque, like statues, like very body horror focused. And she also did the cover for Gretchen Felker Martin's Manhunt
Mhm.
and Gretchen's book Cuckoo. So I found out about her through that, and I just sent her website to Blackstone, my editors at Blackstone, and I said, like, I would love for Sarah to do the cover for this book. And, this is what we decided on. But I think it really speaks to my sensibilities as like an author and just a lover of art. Like, a lot of my previous book covers, like for Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke, and like You've Lost a Lot of Blood, like, those covers were very painting-esque, like very surreal, done by a painter in Sweden named Kim Jacobson, who's an amazing artist. A lot of like, I was saying like my book covers have been much more like aligned with painting and that sort of like hypnotic grotesquerie of like a dreamlike state. But this cover, I showed it to one of my really good friends, and he said it feels like the covers of your previous books have now like come to life, with like this
Uh,
statue of this like androgynous being with their face, their mouth, and their head just like completely disintegrated. And to me, it felt like the perfect cover for this book because it really showcases Ashley. I always think of Ashley as the cover of this book because he's not pierced or tattooed or whatever.
is he like pulling his?
Yeah, he's like
Yeah,
pulling his whole like being apart. And
yeah,
to me, to have him like naked, it just shows like the purification of the ritual, and what he yearns to be. You know what I
yeah.
mean?
Mhm.
Like, to me, it makes perfect sense to have that as like the cover. I feel like it really cues people up to like what to expect inside the book, and also is really just attractive to look at. I feel like it really pops on the shelf.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, circling back to the narrative, Ashley's late wife, Pima, and his missing son, Bailey, repeatedly appear to him during moments of solitude and introspection. Are these visitations manifestations of grief, guilt, or something more supernatural?
I never viewed them as supernatural because I'm not really interested in supernatural horror, like writing about that. My horror fiction is more grounded in like humanity and just human beings doing awful things to one another. That's just what really interests me as not only like a writer of horror, but a consumer of horror. I'm just inherently fascinated by people doing unspeakable things to one another. So it never really occurred to me that it was like a supernatural element that I was infusing into the story. To me, it felt like Ashley losing more touch of himself and his, grasp on reality, and him sort of burrowing deeper inside himself and facing that like really soul devouring introspection, those really like crucial moments of self isolation and realization of all the harm you've done, or that he's done rather. So to me, I feel like those moments really stem from grief and the guilt, the grief from losing Pema, his wife, and the guilt of losing Bailey in such a way where, he was at the supermarket and just like left him unattended for a few minutes and Bailey was gone. So he feels a lot of guilt for that. And I feel like those moments, this book, I never wanted it to be marketed as like supernatural horror because it's not, like, at all. It's not in that realm. It's not in that vein at all. To me, like, this book is more grounded in realistic human horrors and the depravity of mankind and all of the awful things that we do to one another, and even worse, like the awful things that we do to ourselves. I feel like this book really speaks a lot about those things in particular. But yeah, I did worry that like infusing those scenes in the narrative with like the ghosts, the visions appearing to him, like people might misinterpret it and view them as like supernatural entities that are like possessing the story in some way. But I don't know. I mean, people can decide how they want to view the book, and I don't like being like totally certain in one particular thing because I really respect and admire the give and take of like an author and a reader, and like that conversation, the reader sharing, well, this is what I got from it. And as the author, even though I wrote it, like I could still learn from the reader about my own work. Like maybe my subconscious infused certain things in the narrative for reasons that I'm just like not aware of yet. But that being said, like I really feel like those moments are just manifestations of his like losing touch of reality and how he is just decaying not only like outwardly but inwardly as well.
Gotcha. Well, what role do Pima and Bailey play in shaping Ashley's emotional and moral trajectory throughout the novel?
I don't know if Pema really shapes it as much as Bailey does. I think Bailey's presence in Ashley's life, although it was considerably brief, I feel like Bailey had more of an impact on Ashley's trajectory in a lot of ways. I think Bailey reminded Ashley of himself in many ways. He reminded Ashley of his queerness, something that Ashley had really tried to suppress for many years while he was married. I think Bailey was like just a flagrant reminder of all of the things that Ashley detested about himself. And I feel like that's especially true just in that, like, we as human beings, I feel like we hate things that are close to our true selves. We hate things that like we're reminded of, like, oh, that's like a reflection of me, but we don't really view it as a reflection of
You
ourselves. Like,
spot it, you got it.
yeah, exactly. So I feel like Bailey really shaped Ashley's narrative in a lot of ways. And I mean, obviously, there are spoilers I could go into, but I won't. But I definitely feel like Ashley, a lot of the turbulence that he experiences throughout the book, I feel like are either directly or indirectly caused by how he treated Bailey when he was still around him. And, you know, I definitely feel a lot of empathy for Ashley and obviously for Bailey. But yeah, he's a difficult character to sort of like root for entirely because he has done some pretty awful things and said some awful things. But like I said, I really like that in fiction, and I really like exploring characters that have that sort of like grit and roughness to them. I feel like it just makes for a more challenging read. And as long as people are like invested in the story and curious about what's going to happen next, I feel like that's really important.
Hmm. Well, there's one point in the story where we actually get to see Ashley's advertisement, his post, I suppose, and I'm assuming it's on the dark web.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. On the dark web, offering his services to individuals struggling with suicidal ideation. What's interesting is that Ashley actually had legal forms, which, likely wouldn't hold up in court, but were intended to absolve him of all liability. So, do these contracts reflect Ashley's need to feel in control? Are they about easing his conscience, or is there what's going on there?
I feel like it does speak to him wanting to be in control in a lot of ways. And he's somebody who has lost so much and he wants to hold on to anything that he can kind of grasp at. And I feel like maybe he does get some sort of like perverted almost pleasure from luring these people into his business and burying them alive. I mean, a lot of the book speaks about like forbidden pleasures and like fetishes. And I definitely feel like there's a part of Ashley that fetishizes the ritual a little bit, even though he's not really supposed to. But I feel like that's inherently human. You know, I feel like that's, something very human to make something that's some like kind of innocuous, something that's like innocuous or just like pervert it in some way. I feel like and be subversive about it. I feel like that's a very like human reaction. But I also feel like maybe it is him trying to ease his own conscience and him trying to like make the ritual make sense to him in a lot of ways. I feel like it's his way of like grounding himself and centering him as like, oh, this is something that I'm doing for the good of others. And I have legal backing behind me, even though he doesn't really. I feel as though it's both of the things that you mentioned. Like, it's the need for control, which I can definitely empathize with. Like, I'm someone who's very unsettled when I'm not in control of some sort of situation or whatever. It's very difficult for me to like relinquish power to someone else. So I totally can empathize with that. But also, Ashley wants to feel better at the end of the day. Like, he wants to feel better about himself. He wants to purge himself of this sadness, this sorrow. I feel like he also feels a little bit of guilt for the ritual and what he has to do to people in order for them to really experience the true weight of their suicidal ideations and to force them to realize that life is worth living. So he feels a little bit of guilt for that. And I feel as though the contracts are a way to kind of ease that burden and contextualize it in ways that make sense to him. But none of the things that happen in this book, I feel like, make sense to like logical people who are not dealing with incredible amounts of trauma and suffering. Because personally, I can't imagine a scenario where I would willingly get into a coffin and be buried alive for like 30 minutes, you know? And that's the whole point of the book. Like, trauma really informs a lot of our decisions and shapes us in a lot of ways and pushes us to places that are beyond the threshold of respectability. We're pushed to different limits when we are traumatized and when we're suffering and when we're grieving, especially. And I really wanted the book to showcase that.
Well, if it won't produce any spoilers, I was curious to know if there was a particular scene in the book that was either emotionally or technically really hard for you to write.
That's a good question. I think the vignette near the middle of the book, the ordeal of Victor and Tandy, that whole section, that was pretty difficult to write just because of the subject matter. And I don't want to like get into more like spoiler territory. I do want folks to like experience the book and go and kind of raw to it. But that section was pretty difficult only because it's about pretty graphic and disturbing subject matter. And it's funny, I was saying earlier that it feels like purging, like a rebirth or like a spiritual cleanse after writing like such transgressive fiction. But in a lot of ways, like writing that particular section of the book made me feel like filthy in a lot of ways. Like it made me feel like, oh my God, there's something wrong with me. Like, you know, I don't know if anybody's going to publish this. And actually, there was a period of time where I really was not certain if my publisher in the US was going to actually publish this book because of some of the material in it. And there were like internal discussions at the publisher about some of the content. And I actually ended up having to cut quite a bit of material from the end of the book that just didn't make it in just because it was like too graphic. So maybe there will be like an unedited, fully revised version sometime in the future.
Well, you know, maybe you could only sell physical copies on your website. Like Aaron Beauregard has a book called Wet Market, and the only place you can get it is physical off of his website. Like the last time I had him on the show and he was talking about it, he said his publisher literally told him, he's like, dude, don't publish this.
Yeah. I'm really intrigued now. I want to read it.
I mean, you talk about the Streisand effect. Don't publish this. Oh, I want to read this shit.
Yeah, exactly. And I feel like people respond to that. Like, you know, when you post that sort of comment, like someone had to a book, like, oh, this was so depraved and disgusting, like 1 star. Like that to me, that's a selling point. That's something that really intrigues me, that really makes me motivated to go out and buy a copy.
No such thing as bad publicity.
Exactly.
Well, what does a typical writing day look like for you? You more of a structured routine writer or someone who writes in intense bursts?
It really depends on the project I'm working on. I'm very ritualistic when it comes to writing. I like to go about like my morning routine. So I get up and have my cup of tea and maybe do a little bit of exercise for a little bit and check my phone, of course, and kind of have just like my quiet morning. And then from there, I pretty much like go into writing. And I usually set my word count. I try to write, if I'm working on a project pretty regularly, meaning like I'm working on it like Monday through Friday, I'll try to do at least like 2,000 words a day. Sometimes it'll be a lot less, and sometimes it'll be way more than that if I'm feeling like really inspired. But I find that the project sort of tells me what it wants me to do and like how it wants me to interact with it, almost like if it was like a living, breathing thing. Like, you know, there are some projects that I'll work on where I only really work on them in the morning because superstitious me, I have it programmed in my head that I'm going to work on this only in the morning. And that's when I'm going to be like my most capable, my most competent writing self is like in the morning while working on this project. And then other times I'll try to work in the morning and it's like, it's like pulling teeth. Like I can't really get into it. And I decide, okay, I'll try to work on this in the afternoon or maybe even in the evening. And it's all about finding your rhythm. And there is no like perfect answer to this. I feel like there is no like set routine for everyone. Like we're all so different, but like me especially, I like to be very fluid and very like whatever kind of suits me. But I am very militant when it comes to like having deadlines and getting pieces done in time. Like I feel like it's important to, set yourself like very sustainable deadlines and have those for me it works with like a word count. Like I'm going to try to write 2,000 words today. But obviously don't beat yourself up if that doesn't happen, and I try not to like be really hard on myself if I don't make that word count. But yeah, it kind of like ebbs and flows, like how I work on a project. But I'm always writing even when I'm not physically writing, if that makes sense. Like I'm always jotting down ideas like in my notes app on my phone, or I'm talking about a new project I want to work on with my boyfriend. I'll be like, oh, I have this new idea. And then we kind of talk about it together. And I'm just consumed by it constantly, no matter what.
Yeah, kind of backtracking just a little bit, like the vignette you were talking about that was kind of difficult to write. Whenever you do have scenes like that, where, this book or any book where it's really dark and really long, do you ever have to quit and take a break and maybe engage in some sort of a emotional palate cleanser? Like Judith Sonnet told me that if she's in the middle of something that really wears her out, she will stop and watch the Munsters.
I love the Munsters. I watch the Munsters a lot. I love Judith. She's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I definitely need palette cleansers because working on this kind of dark, very bleak material, it will drain you entirely of your energy, and it will really, I hate to say this, but it will for me, like it will poison my mind if I stay too much in one dark place. So I find myself not really engaging that much in watching or reading a ton of horror like I used to. If I'm watching TV, it's probably like a comedy, a sitcom or something. I don't watch a ton of like really fucked up, dark, disturbing movies like I used to, just because I do need that palate cleanser. I do need to take a break every now and then. And I also find myself reading a lot of like literary fiction more than I've been reading horror fiction lately. I've been really more interested in reading just like books about people just going about their lives, like their daily lives, and where nothing really that bad happens. Maybe like some little unsettling things here and there, but I feel like it grounds me a little bit more and gives me the chance to kind of breathe a little bit, because so much of what I write could feel so suffocating a lot of the time, and it could feel really dire and very bleak and frankly upsetting to just think about this constantly. Like I have a very happy life compared to the stuff I write about, my life. And I feel like that's the key to sustainability as a horror author. I feel like having a really great support system and a very sort of average home life, very like loving, supporting home life, I feel like that's so essential for any writer of any genre, but especially horror, because it really does zap you after a while. But I feel like I have a very just normal, very loving home life with my partner, and we have our quiet nights in, and we watch like the Munsters or the Golden Girls, and we're just enjoying life, and or we're going out for dinner or we're meeting friends for whatever. And that's what's going to keep me sustained as a writer of this sort of like dark transgressive fiction.
Yeah, you're taking a walk in the jungle's thrilling, but if you stay there too long, you're going to get eaten.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love the Munsters, but kind of my comfort palate cleanser for some reason, I don't know why, is the Big Bang Theory.
Oh, that's a fun one too. Yeah.
Well, let's see here. What's something you learned about yourself as a writer while working on this book that surprised you?
I think what surprised me wasn't necessarily while I was writing the book, but while I was in the editorial process of the book. I think I realized like how flexible and how agreeable I am to working with others when previously I had thought like, no, I'm like, this is my vision, my book. Like, I don't want any sort of interference. Like, I want complete creative control. But like I was saying, like, there were elements in the ending of the book that I really had to kind of soften or just take out completely. And those conversations were obviously a little difficult to have with my editor. But coming out on the other side of it, I really thought to myself, they're putting a lot of goodwill and a lot of effort behind me. I want to make sure that I'm meeting them where they're meeting me and engage with them meaningfully and prove to them that I am a team player and that I'm willing to make certain sacrifices if it's for the good of the book. And they really wanted to break this book out in a very big way. They wanted to go with, mainstream horror readers and sort of target, like I was saying before, the fans of like Paul Tremblay and maybe John Langan and Grady Hendrix. So I feel like I really learned a lot about myself in the editorial process and how agreeable I could be to suggested changes that could be perceived as like, oh, we don't love the book you gave us, but we're going to publish it anyway. uh, but it wasn't that at all. It didn't feel like that at all. It felt like a collective effort to sort of boost the book up in a bigger way. And I think that, as writers, we obviously want creative control. We want what is in our heart on the page. We want it to be out there with the public and with readers engaging with it meaningfully. But there does eventually come a time when you do have to make certain changes and edits that you aren't like completely in love with. And those edits are difficult and those notes are definitely hard to receive. But I feel like I found a way to maintain my artistic integrity while serving the interest of my editor and what she was hoping for with this book. And I feel like honestly the changes I made, I joke about there being like a unedited version in the future, but I still feel very proud of this book, even with the slight edits that I had to make toward the end of the book where I had to like take out some of the more like really unpleasant graphic depictions, descriptions of the assault. So without going into spoiler territory. But yeah, no, I feel very proud of this book and I feel like I'm really grateful for the experience I had working with Blackstone because it really taught me a lot about how to navigate the industry and how to take notes. And it just surprised me that I was able to kind of take them with such grace and then create something really special out of something that could be perceived as something like a little negative,
Yeah, no, that's huge. Yeah. So I'm almost positive you're not allowed to say anything about this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Your novel was optioned for film by The Walking Dead's Norman, is it Reedus?
Reedus, yeah.
Yeah. So are you allowed to talk about it at all, or are you like NDA'd to death?
No.
Okay.
I can talk about it a little bit. I mean, his team reached out to me back like a couple years ago when things have gotten worse, sort of popped off. And they said that, Norman's a really big fan and would love to like commission you to write a book for his new imprint at Blackstone. And the idea was that this would be like the inaugural book for his publishing imprint at Blackstone, which is called Big Bald Head. And it would be the inaugural title and it would also be optioned for film. Now, the thing is with optioning, really anyone in Hollywood can option a book and a production company can get behind a particular book and say, like, we're optioning this. But it's a different matter of that book actually making it to the screen. So I don't really know what's happening behind the scenes with the book, what sort of stage of development it's in with any film production companies. I know that it has been optioned by his Norman Reedus's production company, but I haven't heard anything really else from that end. But it is really exciting that he was a fan enough to ask me to write this book and commission me to write something that ended up being almost too gruesome and grotesque for them to publish.
Yeah. So you have been praised as one of the strongest and most unique voices in horror today. How do you define your own narrative voice?
I think I grew up reading so much horror. I grew up reading a lot of like the classic, like the Gothics. And then eventually I discovered authors like Clive Barker and Poppy Z. Bright and Kathy Koja, Michael McDowell. I completely fell in love with their literary styles. And I feel like I'm still defining myself and my voice as a writer. I don't know if I've found it entirely. I know that I've definitely locked in on like a certain brand of like queer splatterpunk in your face sort of like transgressive horror. But as far as like defining my like literary style, I'm really just interested in marrying the beautiful with the grotesque, the sublime with the depraved. That to me is just like a really interesting juxtaposition. And I think a lot of the writers that I mentioned previously, like Clive Barker and Poppy Z. Bright, Kathy Koja, like they all really exemplify the high watermark of that sort of lyrical horror genre where it's very baroque sounding, very beautiful, very poetic. And I think I read so much of that that it just sort of informed my own voice and how I sort of navigate my writing now. But I feel like I'm still learning in a lot of ways and I'm still like experimenting with how I want to tell stories. I have a book coming out in September this year. That's the first book of my trilogy of books that's going to be with Titan in the UK and the US. And those books in particular really sort of buck convention and really go in a more like experimental style as far as like storytelling, but I'm really just exploring the possibilities of fiction. And I don't want to be pigeonholed into one thing. I love the fact that I'm known for writing very transgressive and in your face horror, specifically queer horror, but I feel like my style sort of maybe fluctuates a little bit with just how I want to explore and express myself. So I feel like I'm learning each time I sit down at the computer at my desktop here to write. And I feel like it's really exciting. I'm just excited to keep publishing and keep writing and learning more about myself and what I think works in fiction and what I think maybe I could strengthen in my own work. I feel like it's a process where you never are completely defined. You're always just like slightly improving each time you publish a book.
Hell yeah. Well, what do you hope readers take away from At Dark I Become Loathsome, emotionally, philosophically, or personally?
I wrote this book and I really wanted it to be one of those books that just sits with you for days, maybe even weeks. I really want this book to be something that like ruins your day in a lot of ways. I really want this book to just like kind of worm its way into your head and nest there and just remind you when you're doing like the dishes or you're walking the dog. Like, I really want this book to just creep into your mind at the most inopportune moments. And I love that. Like, all of the horror fiction that I've read growing up has done that to me. I think of books like Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. I mean, one of my favorite books of all time. And like the nested stories in that book stay with me many years later down the road. Like, I'm such a fan, obviously, of Chuck, but of material, of fiction that really asks a lot of you and like ravages you in a lot of ways. Like, it makes you uncomfortable, it unsettles you, and it just like challenges you. I really want to write fiction that does that for people. And I think a lot of us become writers because we were so inspired by that one book or that one film that really spoke to us at a formative age. And we were like, oh, I want to create something that does that for somebody else. And I feel like, Chuck did that to me. Clive Barker did that for me. Poppy Z. Bride did that for me. I really, like, they all ruined my day. They all ruined my week or whatever. And I want to be that for somebody else. Like, I want to be that inspiration for someone else to say, like, I want to start writing. I want to start creating something.
Awesome. Well, Eric, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you.
Thank you. This was so much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug or let your readers know about?
Yeah, so my next book comes out in September of this year. It's called We Are Always Tender with Our Dead. It's the first installment of my Burnt Sparrow series, which is a series of books set in a fictional town in the state of New Hampshire and chronicles the decay and rot that sort of infests this town over the span of 20 or 30 years. Over the course of these 3 books, I'll be exploring that sort of decay. But I'm really looking forward to that release, and folks can pick it up on September 9th of this year from Titan Books.
Awesome. We will all look forward to that. And listeners at home, all links will be in the description. And Eric, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest authors and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.